For 500 years, the Roman Empire was the superpower. We're talking about a civilization of incredible cities, unstoppable armies, and brilliant laws that still influence us today. But how on earth did something that seems so permanent, so eternal, just collapse? Well, let's dive into the story, because the fatal flaw was there from day one.
I know, that's a pretty bold statement, right? But the seeds of Rome's destruction weren't really planted by invading armies centuries later. Nope, they were planted by its very founder, right at the moment he created it. And that whole story starts with one of the shrewdest political minds in all of history, the very first emperor, Augustus.
Okay, so after winning a long, brutal civil war, Augustus, who was then called Octavian, pulled off an absolute masterstroke of political theater. He went before the Senate and publicly gave up all his emergency powers, basically saying, "Hey, the Republic is restored." The senators, who were terrified of more war, pretty much begged him to take the power back. It was this brilliant performance, and everyone played their part perfectly.
And that's the new reality he invented. He never called himself a king or dictator. Instead, he took the title Princeps, which just means first citizen. He made a big show of refusing crowns and acting like a servant of the state. But behind that whole facade, Augustus controlled everything. The armies, the money, the courts. He had built an empire while telling everyone he was just their humble first citizen.
And this, right here, is the crucial fatal flaw. Because Rome was officially still a republic, Augustus could never set up a legal, formal way to choose the next emperor. There was no law for it, no clear line to the throne. And what that meant was that every single time an emperor died, the most powerful job in the entire world was suddenly up for grabs.
You can imagine what happened next. This flaw turned the whole transfer of power into a high-stakes lottery. The stability of the known world literally depended on the personality of just one guy. And the results, well, they could be a little unpredictable.
So, when you got lucky, you got someone like Trajan. He was a solid general, a great administrator, and he expanded the empire to its absolute biggest size. Under him, Rome prospered. But when you got unlucky, oh boy, you got Caligula, a man so unhinged and cruel that he terrorized the Senate and, famously, threatened to make his favorite horse a consul, just to show everyone how little he cared for the government.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? The system rewarded guys who were ambitious and cunning enough to claw their way to the top. But once a man had that kind of absolute, unchecked power, those same traits could easily twist into paranoia and pure tyranny. Before he was emperor, Caligula was seen as a pretty clever political player. With ultimate power, he became a monster.
Now, for about 200 years, Rome kind of got lucky for the most part. It survived the bad emperors and really thrived under the good ones. But in the 3rd century, Augustus's little succession problem finally came back to haunt Rome, and the entire system just shattered.
It led to this. An absolutely astonishing 20 different men claimed to be the emperor.
All in a single 50-year period. I mean, just think about that. That's a new emperor on average every 2.5 years. They call this the age of the barracks emperors, because pretty much the only qualification to rule was having an army that was willing to kill the current guy for you. It was just sheer, bloody chaos.
And with the empire constantly tearing itself apart in these endless civil wars, well, everything else fell apart too. A horrible plague wiped out millions. The borders were left wide open for invaders, the economy completely tanked, and huge chunks of the empire, over in Gaul and Palmyra, just broke off and formed their own kingdoms.
The empire was right on the brink of total collapse. It only managed to survive because a few tough military emperors came along and realized you couldn't fix the old system. They decided to just scrap it and build something totally new.
The most radical of these guys was Diocletian. He looked around and said, okay, this empire is way too big for one guy to rule, and the succession is a disaster. So he came up with the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. You'd have 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors who were set to take their place. The goal was to create a clear, predictable pipeline for succession. It was a brilliant, if very authoritarian, solution.
Now, the Tetrarchy itself didn't last very long, but the idea of splitting the empire stuck. Eventually, the Emperor Constantine reunited the whole thing, but he moved the center of power east to a brand new capital, Constantinople. He also put the empire on a completely new path by embracing Christianity, which changed its identity forever.
But all these reforms, they were really just delaying the inevitable. The split between the East and the West eventually became permanent, and the Western half, which was already so weak from centuries of chaos, began its final, irreversible decline.
The last 100 years were just brutal. The empire officially split for good. Then the city of Rome itself was sacked, not once, but twice. Can you imagine the psychological shock of that? It was a sign that the end was truly near. And then, finally, in 476, a Germanic chieftain kicked out the last emperor, a young boy who, in a perfect twist of historical irony, was named Romulus, just like Rome's legendary founder. The chieftain didn't even bother naming a replacement.
So, you see, in the end, the so-called barbarian invasions weren't really the cause of Rome's fall. They were just the final symptom. For centuries, that fatal flaw right in its foundation, the lack of a stable succession, had fueled civil wars that drained its resources, wrecked its economy, and left it so brittle it just couldn't handle the pressure anymore.
And all of this leaves us with one last big question. While the Western Empire crumbled and eventually became the kingdoms of modern Europe, the Eastern Empire, running out of Constantinople, actually survived and thrived for another 1,000 years. So did Rome really fall, or did it just change into something new?